thank you for being here and giving me the possibility to present to you the latest work I've been doing with Ümit, that is on the political economy of growth regimes in Poland and Turkey. And here's the outline of our paper and therefore also of our presentation. After a short introduction, I will go over the theoretical framework, touching upon many of the concepts that have been presented in the presentations before ours. And then we will move forward to the empirical assessment of the growth regimes in Poland and Turkey, and adding to that an analysis of the political economy of these two growth regimes, and then we'll conclude. So with this paper, we aim to contribute to this debate. We try to do so by applying a consistent post-Keynesian macroeconomics framework with a demand and growth regime approach, or maybe how Akcay has now started to call it the national income financial accounting decomposition approach on the macroeconomic side. And we complement this by a CPE approach where we focus on dominant social blocks, but also we try to bring in the concept of growth strategy that has also been touched upon already. And we use it to try to bridge these two concepts that, as we have also seen, has sometimes a form of misunderstanding. And also because they operate on different levels of analysis, I think this concept of growth strategies might be helpful, but I will go into more detail in that later. And yeah, empirically, as I've said, we then investigate the growth regimes of Poland and Turkey and the respective dominant social blocks and growth strategies. So therefore, we try to make 4 contributions with this paper. So first, a conceptual calibration that will allow us to have a consistent framework that allows us to apply the CPE or political economy approaches backed by a consistent post-Keynesian macroeconomic framework. And on the empirical side, we then assess the growth regimes of Poland and Turkey, the dominant social blocks and growth strategies. And lastly, we try to establish links between these levels of analysis. So I think I can be rather quick on this approach. I think it has been at least mentioned by Akcay. So we do this demand and growth regime national accounting approach, where we look at the growth contributions by the different aggregate demand components and the financing by looking at the sectoral financial balances. And this approach, as it's common in the growth model perspective, therefore stresses the importance of demand for output and growth, but also looks at how demand is financed and the related deficit dynamics between and within economies. And this goes well in hand with the notion that growth regimes or models are seen as as potentially unstable. And also this makes it easier to highlight the international interactions between national growth regimes. So these are the 4 categories I will also briefly touch upon because Akcay has, I think, mentioned them already. So we have on the one hand the export-led mercantilism, where high growth contribution by net exports and current account surpluses, positive net exports. And then we have the domestic demand-led regime, where growth is almost exclusively driven by domestic demand components. Sometimes or often we also have a negative financial balance of the public sector in this regime, and the current account is balanced or rather negative. And then we have the weakly exported regime, what is kind of in between, you can say, between those both regimes. Maybe it's on the transition between those both regimes. And the 4th regime is the so-called debt-led private demand boom regime that is characterized by negative growth contribution of net exports and a negative current account. But on the other hand, high contributions by private consumption or residential investment, and the financial balances of the private sector are negative or even close to balance. So the demand is to some extent financed by households going into debt or saving. And of course, the study of capitalist variety cannot stop here by identifying these demand and growth regimes, but also it has to be complemented, as Akcay has already said, always with the analysis of what drives these demand components. And in the former panel, we have also seen two presentations on possible growth drivers. So on the macroeconomic side, the analysis or the category of demand and growth regimes, we try to complement with a macroeconomic policy regime or growth drivers approach. So these are the factors that lead to demand components to rise and then ultimately growth to occur. maybe on a quick side note, I think empirically we have to do more on this part in the paper, but for the whole framework, this is also what has to be here. And yeah, so then the question for us was how to bridge this with the CPE part. Of course, it has become quite fashionable to look at the dominant social blocks, to analyze the cross-sectoral, cross-class alliances that support a specific growth regimes, so they are unified by a common economic ideology or growth strategy, and they therefore try to determine the policies and institutional setting to achieve their strategy. And possible components of this dominant social blocks may then be business associations, labor unions, subaltern classes, or farmers, for example. And yes, as I've said, this dominant social bloc is characterized by a strategy, and I think I want to definitely redevelop this part by reading Bruno's paper, because I think some things he said is very also motivated our research here, or our incorporating of this category, because we view here the growth strategy not necessarily something that is aiming at a specific demand and growth regime, but as a broadly economic policy project by the dominant social bloc that can have different policy goals than growth, as it was already mentioned in the discussions beforehand. But also, therefore, it can also incorporate other policies that do not necessarily aim at macroeconomic outcomes. For example, what we will see at Poland, policies that touch upon the topic of ownership, of the nationalization of ownership, but also social security program extension that may not become macroeconomic actively effective, but will serve to soften some conflicts and to bring about a compromise. So this is why we decided to bring in the growth strategy as a separate category from macroeconomic policies, but also from the dominant social bloc as such. Yeah, so having presented broadly our theoretical framework, we will now go further into the empirical assessment of our two countries. Of course, the growth regimes of Poland and Turkey have already been assessed with this approach presented in large-scale analysis. Most famously, we have there a separation between the pre- and post-global financial crisis period. And this is also the periodization we are going to choose. However, what is like one downside of this method is that we already have this periodization, and therefore what happens in between the periods their changes might go unnoticed, and therefore we aim here to do an assessment on an annual basis in order to see maybe changes within the period. And what I'm going to present to you is that for the two countries we are investigating, we largely can confirm the findings for Poland in two ways. We confirm it in the way that the breaking point in the regime is more or less the global financial crisis, and before we witnessed a more domestic demanded regime, what then became a weekly exported regime. In Turkey, on the other hand, we see that pre-global financial crisis, we had a domestic demanded regime as it's stated in the literature. However, for the post-global financial crisis, we see that there's a second structural breaking point with different regime occurring afterwards. So we have the period from 2010 until 2013, where Turkey incurred a debt-led private demand boom regime, and onwards a weekly export-led regime. But you will see this in more detail in some slides. So as I said, for Poland, we largely corroborate the findings that we have seen in the large-scale analysis. So pre-global financial crisis on the left-hand side on this slide, growth was almost exclusively driven by domestic demand components. Of course, especially in years with low growth, we sometimes see positive contributions by net exports, but there are many years when net exports are negative and not contributing to growth. And on the other hand, in the post-global financial and post-Eurozone crisis period, we see that growth contribution of net exports are not visible, i.e. they are largely balanced or even positive in more years than the years before. And the change to the regime becomes more evident if we look at the sectoral financial balances of Poland. There we see that the external sector has secured was positive, meaning that the current account of Poland was here negative, and we see that this deteriorated, i.e. the Polish external position improved and current account became positive. At the same time, after the global financial crisis, we see a fiscal consolidation. And yeah, so they're the breaking point between the domestic demand regime on the left-hand side and the more weakly export-led regime becomes evident here. And we also see characteristically for a more export-led regime that the net export position of Poland after the global financial crisis increased or improved. So now looking briefly at the Turkish growth contribution pre and post financial crisis, we see the domestic demand regime in the years before, with net exports contributing negatively to growth, and growth being exclusively driven by domestic demand and components, with a large contributions by investment notably. Then we have the global financial crisis, and afterwards we see negative contributions by net exports still, and still large contributions by private consumption and investments. And after 2014, where we see overall that the growth of Turkey is declining and the position of net exports, the contribution of net exports is improving. And yeah, and so we would argue that we see here the shift after 2014 to a more weakly export-led regime. And this is also what the sectoral financial balances hint at to some extent. There we have the problem that at least for the whole time period, we only have the data for the private sector, not disaggregated in the corporate and the household sector. But what we see is that that the private sector, especially after the global financial crisis, is in constant negative territory, while after the 2014 period, the external sector decreases its position, and the position becomes more clear if we look at the 2009-2017 period, where luckily we have some disaggregated data, and there we see that both components of the private sector are in negative territory after 2009 and 2014. And also the external sector is in the years after 2013 decreasing. And yeah, and also most notably is that after the years of 2013, and I almost forgot to say that, of course, the breaking point 2013-14 is the taper tantrum, so that the global financial cycle tightened in the course of the announcement of the US Federal Reserve in tapering its asset purchase program would lead to capital outflows from emerging capitalist economies, and notably also from Turkey. And we see that after these years, there was a continuous trend of an improved net export position in Turkey. So here, just as a quick summary of the regime identification for these two countries, as I've already said, and let me end on this note that what I've already hinted at in the theoretical framework, that growth models do not emerge out of thin air, rather they are a product of those strategies that key actors, government, producer groups, and business elites pursue to secure investment and profitability, and in turn income and employment growth. And on that, I will end, and Ümit will go further with the political economy analysis of this.
Okay, right. So we are trying to, as Benjamin already said, we are trying to combine these two aspects of the same phenomena. On the one hand, macroeconomic regimes, on the other hand, social basis of this changes. So what we see in these two countries is that in both countries there was this change in the dominant social bloc, more or less around 2008 crisis. And if we link this debate to the first session, so basically what our strategy is trying to identify growth strategy based on the official, maybe official documents of governments. So if we follow this research strategy, we see that in both countries there was a shift in growth strategies from between pre-crisis and post-crisis period. And here in Poland, on the left-hand side, you can see some changes. I will provide a little bit more detail in next slides, but here you can see a summary of 2000s and 2010s, maybe. At the beginning of 2000s, basically, there was a agenda of deepening market reforms as an extension of European Union membership agenda. And basically this further alienated the traditional low-skilled blue-collar workers, and it basically eroded the social base of previous dominant social bloc. And after the third wave of market reforms came after 2008 crisis in Poland, basically there was a narrowing support for political centers and a rise of nationalist conservative powers under the leadership of Law and Justice Party in PIS party in Poland. Therefore, there was a new emerging dominant social bloc guided by the nationalist conservative political class, supported by local managers of multinational companies and mostly blue-collar workers after 2015. So we basically rely on Marek Nacek's the argument on this local managers driver or business push towards a new direction in the agenda of developmentalism. On the other hand, in Turkish case, Turkish story, you can see on the right-hand side. So basically, after 2013, there was a slowing down in the economic growth, and then it basically undermined the previous social bloc, consists of both core capitalists and some elements of subaltern classes. And we also saw that there was an increasing weight of peripheral capitalists in the dominant social bloc. And here, maybe Turkish case is a good case study for this discussion, because we see contradictory macroeconomic tendencies at the same time. Therefore, as Amable's emphasis already told us, there must be, or we should maybe start with the conflict, social conflict. Therefore, in Turkish case, we see contradictory growth strategies driven by different capital fractions and different interests. So, but at the end, we saw that if we follow the pattern after 2013, we can identify that this peripheral capitalists' weight in the dominant social bloc has increased, and it resulted in changes in the macroeconomic policies. In the next slide, a little bit more detail about Poland. As I briefly summarized, I'm basically following the literature here. 3 waves of market reforms in Polish case. First wave, of course, came after collapse of the real socialism, and came with the shock therapy program. And the second wave of market reforms came with the EU membership, and the third wave, as I mentioned, came after global financial crisis. Maybe I should emphasize the political aspect here. After second wave of market reforms, particularly, basically Social Democrats was eliminated from the political scene, very similar to basically all social democrat parties in Europe. And the reason was basically the former ex-communists, new social democrats was basically implementing this market reforms, and this clearly undermined their social base. And in the third wave, or as a result of third wave, basically, we saw different tendencies here, or kind of differences, different reactions. Decline of the centrist politics is again a common feature, maybe after 2008 crisis, and rising this nationalist conservatives are also common in many countries. And what was interesting for Polish case was that the state managers basically started to complain about this dependent market economy, and actually this current prime minister of Poland basically cited Andreas Noelke's work and said that we no longer want to have a dependent market economy. Therefore, they implemented deliberately a kind of new growth strategy aimed to put an end of this dependent structure. But state managers were not alone. So basically, business mobilization supported this new growth strategy. And as a result of this whole story, basically what we saw that mostly because of external pressures, growth model has changed after 2008 crisis, along with many countries in Europe. But this deliberate strategy aimed to consolidate this change, consolidate this export-oriented regime. So in the next slide, here we can see a little bit more detail about this new strategy. The keyword here is repolonization, which means increasing national ownership in the crucial sectors like banking and retail sector or energy sector. As I mentioned here, one of the key actors is that local managers of multinational companies, and you can see a great explanation for in Marek Neček's paper based on interviews and case studies. And in the next slides, I can provide a quick summary about Turkish case. Here, the story starts with the 2001 crisis, and after 2001 crisis, there was a kind of new economic policy framework was established, and or maybe the unifying goal of this new economic regime, supported by neo-dominant social bloc, was maintenance of the strong Turkish lira, strong national currency. So here, this strong Turkish lira policy was supported by kind of or set of institutional reforms like central bank independence or establishment of independent regulatory agencies. And similar to Polish case, the European Union membership carrot was an important anchor during that time. EU membership prospects and plus IMF program, of course. So there were two anchors during that time. And then high interest rates, of course, attracted foreign capital, and it created the decline, the inflation rate, and it also created a stabilization in Turkish lira. But during the same time, the government was able to privatize almost all productive public investments, and it crashed the labor union's power, and labor union density declined dramatically during that period, and stagnant wages were mostly stagnant. Therefore, this overvalued Turkish lira on the one hand created a kind of increase in purchasing power of lower classes as well, because as long as Turkish lira, the national currency is strong, import became cheaper, and consumption goods became more available for under or subaltern classes as well. But of course, it created problems for macroeconomic problems, because this strong Turkish lira basically incentivized imports and disincentivized export. It creates more current account deficit, and also it undermined the productive structure of country in both agriculture and industry sector. What Dani Rodrik called as the premature deindustrialization was basically resolved. In 2013 or after 2013, this slowing economic growth rate basically, as I mentioned, undermined the previous dominant social bloc. Here, increasing weight of the peripheral capitalists who concentrated on in the low-tech, labor-intensive sectors, and their numbers are, of course, larger than the core capitalists. Therefore, they are also important for electoral reasons. So their weight in the dominant social bloc has increased. As a result, now, starting from last year, we saw empirical evidence for this new strategy, with this huge change in the monetary policy, and in 2021.
Ümit, I'm sorry, could you come to an end, because otherwise we're running completely out of time. Okay.
This new strategy is based on the high negative interest rates, and the idea is as long as we depreciate national currency, it will bring us and competitiveness in the international arena. Basically, price competitiveness is the basic strategy of this newly established dominant social bloc, and the government is part of this newly established dominant social bloc. In the next slide, we provided a brief summary here. And maybe the important part is for Turkey, there was a change. So the global conditions or international conditions has changed after 2013, specifically for Turkey. And there was an adjustment period in the dominant social bloc. And in 3 years after 2021, basically new strategy starts to implement. On the other hand, in Polish case, as you can see in the second slide, there was already a change in the growth regime, and the aim of strategy was not a regime change, but consolidate of the already existing growth regime. So these are the main findings. So in the last slide, in the conclusion, there is a summary here. We try to bring together these two frameworks, and empirically, as I mentioned, we try to establish that The change in the dominant social bloc and its growth strategy consolidates the prevailing. The growth regime in Poland, on the other hand, change in the dominant social bloc with a new strategy aims to establishing or forming a new growth regime in Turkey. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Ümit. And we move on to the next speaker,